So you're going to get the Mac addicts to join, sure. The people who have...
Well, Apple has some really good stuff on it.
Yeah.
Now, I've discovered. Apple's got a bunch in the sci-fi realm, and it's made in such a way that, that it's made a name for itself, I think. It's almost like the Sci-Fi Channel. It's got other things in it, too.
You know, when I had cable TV, Sci-Fi Channel had to be part of the package. I didn't want cable TV if that didn't come with the package. Forget it. That was it.
Yeah. One of the things I do like about this series is the way they use music to really set the mood. The music is setting the mood for each series.
A lot of disasters could happen. Yeah. After you're done, though, that's when everything starts to sink in. You do your after-action report. You're briefed and debriefed, and then you go on with your life. You may have to go see a doctor.
Yeah, it's not the kind of show I thought it was. You know, first off, I heard that it was us not making it to the moon and the Russians. And it's like, okay, we got a show about us running second place to the Russians. You know, and I didn't figure it was going to last.
Let us have faith in Abraham Lincoln's words that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand.
That's what we're talking about.
Those are the
God bless you, and God bless America.
That's good filmmaking right there.
The opinions expressed in tonight's podcast are those of the individuals speaking. They do not necessarily reflect the views of Harris Film Productions or its other crew members.
Hello, everybody. This is Steve Harry Harris and the Harris Film crew. Here's our Harris Film lead visual effects artist and co-host, Ken Mayes.
Tucker, if I had any Danubian gems left from the Orions, you'd be a winner.
Discussing For All Mankind and how it relates to Star Trek.
Basically discussing on an episode-by-episode basis how this relates to the events that we've seen in Star Trek, and how it relates to the events that we experienced in real life. I mean, there's some of the things that you watch in this show that you just go, man, I wish that had really happened.
Yeah. Well, I remember in the 1970s, we had a teacher who drove an electric car, and everybody wanted that electric car. And then she got into a car accident, and it totaled the car. It was made out of fiberglass. The frame, I don't know what's frame, but the frame was probably like an aluminum type situation, and it was total.
Back then, it would have had to have been extremely lightweight.
It was, yeah. She had it was catastrophic.
Yeah,
and
definitely wouldn't have been up to cafe standards.
Right. So yeah, technology though could have really taken a turn for a different way of doing business, and I'm very disappointed at the way a lot of this stuff has come out, or has shaken out, if you want to call it that.
I do know that in interviews that he's given and everything, one of the divergent points, there's basically two main divergent points from our history and the history of For All Mankind. First one was in our reality, the head of the Soviet space program, Roscosmos, was named Korolev. Korolev had spent some time in the gulags during Stalin's regime. And as a result, he had been beaten very badly and had kidney damage as a result. So later, after Stalin was out, Korolev moved up through the Soviet system and actually gained control of one of their projects, which led directly, became Roscosmos and was directly in charge of their space program. But he was very politically savvy. He knew how to navigate the communist system and keep his area on top. to get the proper funding, to get what he needed and everything. Well, in early, I believe it was 61 or 62, he had some further issues with his kidneys, and he had to go in and get a transplant. And he ended up dying as a result of that operation. Basically, it was not successful. And without him to keep things focused, and he was the driving force, they just lost it. And then the second one was the development of their N1 rocket, which I don't know if y'all are aware of that. It was supposed to be the answer to our Saturn V. But our Saturn V, had 5 main rocket bells on the bottom. Theirs had 32 rocket bells.
Oh my goodness.
Right.
But the thing is that on their very first launch, they got down to 0, and then they had a failure, and it wouldn't launch. And they didn't know what was wrong. And the higher-ups in Moscow called them and said, failure is not an option. You get that thing in the air. Get the teams out there. And so they sent 150 of their top technicians out to the launch pad to find out why they did not fire. And then it exploded.
Yeah.
Massive fireball. Killed all 150 of their top engineers.
Yeah.
And that basically, they were not able to recover. That's why they did not land on the moon first. Because Korolev and the N1 rocket exploding were the 2 main failures they had that just knocked them right straight out of the space race.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, the head of the scientific team actually died out there too. The one that was in charge of the rocket.
Yeah, the new head. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And it was because the politicians in Moscow could not look bad to the world.
Right.
There was no such thing as a communist failure. Everything was a success. Everything had to be perfect.
Exactly.
And as a result, they basically failed.
That was the thing about the Soviet system is in public, there's no failure. Everything's perfect.
Right.
And so every time a big person there was a MiG-25 Foxbat pilot who landed in Japan in the 1970s. He jumped out of the cockpit and held a gun to the Japanese Air Force and the police because he didn't know what to do. After, here I am, I want to give up. You can have my plane, but what do I do? He didn't know how to react when he landed. They took him into custody and he said, I'm just here to give this to you in defect. I want to work with America. And when that happened, God only knows what happened to his family. It's one of those situations where you just do not want to be involved in a totalitarian system and worry about all of the fallout if you do something that they think is wrong or that you don't agree with their particular agenda.
Yeah. There are other things in the episodes too that I'll have to point out when we get to them. Like I'm sure y'all have all heard of Chappaquiddick.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in this history, there's some kind of event that happens in the space race, and as a result, it's the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment.
Equal Rights Amendment.
Because someone changes a vote, Ted Kennedy ends up having to make an emergency trip back to Washington to cast a vote in the Senate. And as a result, he's not there that weekend at Chappaquiddick.
Well, that's interesting.
And without that event happening, there's no scandal, and therefore nothing blocking him from running for president and gaining the nomination and later the presidency.
Interesting.
So yeah, we got a Ted Kennedy presidency in this timeline.
Wow.
No Gerald Ford.
Well, well, I just took him totally out of the stage here. Hold on.
Scandal.
There you are.
comes out a little bit early, and it was just enough that Kennedy ends up winning over Nixon in 1972.
Wow.
So Nixon does not get his second term.
That's an interesting change of events.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like the I don't know if Kennedy had not been elected. If JFK had not been elected, we wouldn't have had the space race the way that we did either. But
Well, you got to remember though, Nixon was the one that basically killed a lot of the space program. He killed the Nerva program. He killed Apollo. There were a lot of other programs they had running that basically everything was pared back except for the space shuttle. And in this version with Kennedy, because the space program was the legacy of John Kennedy, Kennedy just kept ramping up the funding. So Nerva was not canceled. Apollo was not canceled. They went all the way up to like Apollo 24.
Wow.
And then, of course, you got the space shuttle on top of that. And then they actually, while the space shuttles are still flying in the 80s, they go on to the next generation shuttle.
Is it larger?
Oh, yeah. It's called Pathfinder. It's about the size of a 747.
So what's the purpose of Pathfinder?
Ferrying people back and forth from the Earth to the moon.
Only the moon, not Mars?
Not yet.
Not yet.
See, in my reality that I thought was going to happen in the 1960s, I expected the first man on Mars, and maybe even the first woman on Mars, by 1975 or something like that. I don't know, 78, 80, somewhere around there. But we missed our window, there was a window where the Earth and the Mars were going to be at the closest point for years.
That was in 1984. There's a novel you need to look up. It's called, dang, I forget the name of it. Stephen Baxter wrote it. But it's an alternate history. And it's similar in a lot of ways to For All Mankind. But in that novel, the Nerva program does in fact end up being canceled because of an accident that they have in orbit. They have basically a coolant line breaks to the nuclear reactor, and they end up having a meltdown in orbit. And because weight was such an issue, there was not a lot of shielding between the crew cabin and the reactor. And when the reactor got supercritical, the astronauts all got lethal doses of alpha radiation.
So explain the Nerva program.
Yeah, by the time the astronauts disconnected and then came down to re-entered, they had all died of radiation poisoning because they took such a massive dose.
Wow.
Yeah, they were dead before they got to the ground. And that ends up canceling the Nerva program because, a nuclear reactor running down out in space is just, oh, crap. Because then they had to send up a follow-up mission to dock with the runaway reactor and then propel it on into the sun.
Yeah.
Just to get rid of it. But,
so give us a rundown quickly of what Nerva was all about. Was it about a nuclear-powered spacecraft?
Yes, Nerva was a nuclear propulsion. What it was is they would take a nuclear reactor and they would purposefully run it into supercritical mode. And then they would dump liquid hydrogen as coolant directly into the core. And the heat from the core would flash that liquid hydrogen into steam. And then they would just vent it out the back.
So how fast do you think it went?
Well, they predicted that you could get about twice the propulsion that you could from a chemical rocket.
Wow.
But get this. Where did they test it? The desert. How did they test it? They set up a reactor on a stand and they vented the hydrogen directly into the atmosphere.
Oh my gosh.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
That's
we're lucky
government
we're all
for you.
alive.
But the thing is that as it's venting into the atmosphere, it's carrying hard radiation with it.
Exactly.
So
So
basically,
it's
you're
like a
just
Chernobyl event right there in the desert.
you're just venting this straight up into the air. Which, being hydrogen, it's going to continue to rise and go on up into the stratosphere. But the heavier particles that are left over from the reaction are going to eventually sift back down again.
So lots of people dying from cancer because we decided to do this. Not
Yeah,
a good idea.
not only that, but a lot of the engineers that were testing it were actually standing around the damn thing while it was venting.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they just had no idea.
Unbelievable.
They should have had an idea, but
Well,
they had no
it's
idea.
going straight up. It's going straight up. It's, we're okay.
Well, it's real rocket science, okay? And they're real rocket scientists. You'd think they'd know better. The phrase is not rocket science. Well, it is. Hello.
It was a whole new frontier, How do you defend against the unknown?
That's true too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I understand the political pressure too with
these
the
were
Soviet
also
space race.
these were engineers that should have known better. It's not like nuclear power and radiation wasn't unknowns in the 1960s when this was happening.
I think he's dissing us engineers there, Admiral Roy. For those of you who haven't seen our show, Commander Stahl
all I
is
can say is we all have 20/20 hindsight, and we have access to knowledge that would have been high in back then.
Yeah.
So yes, maybe they should have known better, but they also had the government lying to them because they didn't know.
Right.
Yeah. The other form of nuclear propulsion is the one I'm sure y'all have all heard of, where you just drop a nuclear bomb out the back and use a pusher plate.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
They do use that in For All Mankind.
Wow.
When they do finally make the trip to Mars, that's the technology they use.
Wow.
Can you imagine? Yeah, dropping atomic bombs out the back end, blowing them up, pushing you forward, dropping another one, going forward, and it's all happening like whatever.
One after the other.
So that
structural integrity was wow.
I don't know why that didn't work.
Yeah. I also rig a solar sail as well.
Well, that makes more sense, at least as an emergency.
Yeah. There's a character in the later seasons that kind of reminds you of Elon Musk. He's a black African, but he's a super multi-billionaire, and he starts his own company called Helios, and he's determined he's going to get to Mars. And it's like, well, yeah, that sounds like Elon Musk.
Yeah.
But that was a real race.
The race for Mars ends up being a four-way race. The United States, Russia, Helios, and North Korea.
North Korea, not China?
Yep. North Korea. Weird. The Chinese were trying, but their rocket blew up on launch, so they didn't make it.
So in that timeline,
so how did Korea get advanced technology?
Yeah, that's my question.
Same as everybody else that got it. Theft of patents and knowledge.
Yeah. So the communist Chinese weren't working with the Soviet Union on rocket technology.
No, they were, during that era, they were not getting along well with Moscow.
Détente. Is that why it was the era of détente? Okay.
Yeah. They
without
they do have Gorbachev.
Without Nixon,
but
they may not have had détente, may not have
Yeah, only Nixon could go to China, right?
Yeah, well, and we maintained a very hostile relationship with the Soviets all the way through the 80s. And then Gorbachev comes in later and perestroika and all that opens up. But then in 1992, there's a coup. Gorbachev is kicked out of power and the hardliners take over again. So basically, the Soviet Union never falls.
So that Yeltsin never took over. Gotcha.
Right.
Well, that's definitely an interesting timeline. I don't think I like it politically, but I like the alternate reality with the scientific ramifications.
Yeah. A lot of the same things wind up happening for different reasons.
Yeah.
Maybe slightly different times. You know, they evolve.
The Apollo Soyuz mission, for instance. In our reality, it took place in 1974. In their reality, it takes place in 1983.
Wow. Was it the same? It would have been different mission commanders and everything then.
Yeah. And it's also, it was also, they went with the Apollo because they didn't want to let the Soviets see the interior of our shuttles.
The new stuff.
So they said, well, we still have a couple of old Apollos left. You get to use one of those.
That makes sense.
That way they don't see any of our new modern stuff.
Right.
It's a little odd, Steve. At different times, you know, they were buddy with the Russians like a team, and other times they, you know, they went back to the Cold War mentality. But the Cold War changed. It wasn't exactly a Cold War at the time, but you know, they were still competitors, but also working together because they, you know, these were really expensive projects, you know, and they sort of made a deal.
So Roy, you've seen this show that we're talking about?
You also get to find out, can an M16 fire on the moon?
Oh.
The United States Marine Corps finds out.
We actually sent.
Well, as long as it's fired in an oxygen environment, it would work. You know, inside. I don't know if it would work on.
Well, the cartridge, the bullets, when they're packed, they have their own oxygen supply. So yes, it would fire.
Okay.
Interesting.
But you have to modify it because the ejector system would not work properly. So you have to have some kind of add-on to the rifle to provide enough pressure for the action to work.
So they added a CO2 cartridge or something into the mix. Yeah. That kind of makes sense.
They also have to paint the rifles white.
Why?
Otherwise, in the heat of the sun, they would overheat.
Oh, wow.
That black metal would get very, very hot otherwise.
Yeah, I imagine so.
That's very interesting. All these things you have to throw into the mix. Yeah.
Well, the thing that got me about our original space race, I've talked to Ken about this before. Scientifically, even as, you know, a 5, 6, 8-year-old, whatever, in the 1960s, it did not make sense for us not to have women astronauts. In other words, why were women not allowed to become active astronauts in our space program? There was what they call them, the Mercury 13, that were the women that were civilian pilots.
In fact, one of the characters,
the training process.
One of the characters in this show is named Molly Cobb. She's based on Geraldine Cobb, who was one of the actual Mercury 13 astronauts. Another sneak peek.
What is this
This is from season 2.
Okay.
Let us have faith in Abraham Lincoln's words that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand.
That's what we were talking about.
Those are the
God bless you, and God bless America.
Oh, a jumper.
Fuel 60%.
Is this something they figured out?
The Russians claimed to jump our mining operation on the moon.
Oh, wow.
So they were sent to take it back.
Obviously not meant to fly in that manner.
Holding at 5 meters. Steady at 5 meters.
Steady. Canyon entrance. Hang on out there. Some tight turns coming up. All right, commence control run. 60 seconds drop.
10 meters. Down at 8. Tracy Stevens, you're a badass. We have the site. I repeat, we have the site.
Placed it with the American flag. Yeah. They wouldn't have left the other flag in the dirt, though. They would have taken it back as a trophy. Excellent. That particular segment we watched was about Geraldine Cobb being the first woman astronaut in the timeline for all mankind. Ken, go ahead and tell us a little bit about Geraldine. Was she part of the Mercury 13?
Yeah, she was one of the members of the original Mercury 13. For women who were training basically right alongside the men, doing all the same tests, everything. But then right at the last minute, a political decision was made that Americans don't want to see their women blow up in rockets. So basically, boom, they cut them.
We don't.
After they had done everything to prove that they had a right to be there, they got cut.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the 80s that Sally Ride ended up being the first woman to actually go up. And that was aboard the space shuttle. So basically,
right.
It set them back 20 years or more.
Let me make this clear. Each job depends on your capabilities as a human being. Okay. Well, these ladies went through the exact same process as the Mercury 7. Okay. And by Gemini, they were qualified, but NASA did not want to deal with biological issues dealing with women, feminine products, for example. What do you do? How do you, how do you use this product in space? How many do we need? How do you dispose of them? Biohazards and it's like, sit down in a room and work it out, people. It's human. It's a biological human function that humans have to deal with. If you can deal with it on Earth, figure out how to do it in space. It's not that, it's rocket science, right? It's not.
Yeah. There's this funny scene. There's this funny scene when the first female astronaut has been chosen, and they're in the process of training for the mission, and somebody said, "Oh, what about the facilities when she has to go? We didn't think about that. It's designed for male parts."
Right.
And one of the engineers suggests, well, maybe she can do like what they did on the old Geminis. She can just wear a diaper.
Right.
And Ed Baldwin, who is the mission commander, he says, "No one in my crew is going to the moon wearing a damn diaper." You're engineers, figure it out.
Vacuum system of some kind. Build it into the suit. It shouldn't be that hard. They used to make spacesuits individually for each astronaut. So there were individualized parts for each suit. Through.
One of the things I do like about this series is the way they use music to really set the mood. And they pick the music from the right eras when they do it. You know, it's like when we're in the 70s, it's all 70s music. When they're in the 80s, it's 80s music. They're in the fourth season of the show in the early 2000s now. So they're using early 2000s music. So it's the music is setting the mood for each series.
We hope you've enjoyed the show. Come back and see us another time.
We'd like to send a shout out to No Budget Productions and Vance Major in particular. Thank you for helping us with our productions here at Harris Film. Like, comment, subscribe, and share all of our videos. Good night.